Shalom, welcome back to this series of programs, The Service of the Heart. I'm Dr. Dinah Dye with Foundations in Torah and HRN. And last time we kind of left off quickly talking about what's going to happen to the Jewish people when the temple is destroyed and they go into the diaspora. And this is the time of the Roman destruction of the temple, 70 Common Era. And I think that you should see by now that they were strategically placed here with what was about to happen. The temple service was well developed before it was destroyed, and that which was in the temple service became part of the synagogue service. That was well developed as well, all taken back to the time of Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly. So I believe that they were well prepared, spiritually speaking, for what was about to happen and the great tragedy that was the result of the destruction of the temple and their removal from Jerusalem and ultimately their removal from the land. Now really, if you think about it, this would have been a fatal blow to the faith, except for the establishment of the synagogue. It was well established in all parts of the empire. So as they scattered out of Jerusalem and headed to other parts of the empire and ended up ultimately in Europe and in England and later emigrating to the United States many centuries later, the synagogue is solid, in place, well established, and the whole service continues on. The liturgy is well established as well. So now, basically, God is ready to meet the people, if you will, as they are scattered to the four corners of the earth. And then He promises at His time appointed by Him, that they will return to the land and they will be ingathered to the land, and this sort of has multiple applications too, but that their identity will remain intact, and this is certainly the case. Let's read from the Psalm 65. These are verses 2, 3, and 5. It says, "To you, God, in Zion, silence is praise. You listen to prayer. To all you who are living creatures to come, how blessed are those you choose and bring near." Now, just show you in this particular example, that word there, bring near, is actually the very root meaning of the offerings. The offerings in Hebrew, in the root is karav, and the plural would be korbanot. Those would be the offerings. But we can see just from this prayer in Psalm 65 that how connected it is to the whole offering service. And you'll find that as you start to recognize terms that are from the liturgy and from the temple service, in the Psalms, you'll see why that psalm might have been chosen and why it was a part of the liturgy. So many of the Psalms have little phrasings in them that relate to some aspect or some part of the temple and ultimately some part of the synagogue. Now we have somebody named Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he was trying to impart in the people the hope that even though the temple service has been suspended, the temple's been destroyed, it would be for just a brief time, that ultimately the temple would be rebuilt. And remember, if we go back to several programs prior to Exodus 25:8, we see that this was the standing commandment in every generation, that they would rebuild the Mishkan, the sanctuary, and the tabernacle and the mikdash, which is the sanctuary, the holy temple. So this was always in the heart of the people from the very beginning, is to build a sanctuary for God. So no matter what happens, no matter what the diaspora and the exile, etc., planted in the hearts of the people. Certainly at the time of Babylon, the prophets were sent, specifically Ezekiel was sent to minister to them and to keep ever before them the desire to return and to rebuild. And God has always established that no matter when they're or where they're in exile, that somebody or something would keep that before them. Now we have the synagogue service has become the temple service essentially. And so this reminder, and as they go through the prayers and they sing the different prayers and the psalms are in there, this constant reminder of the temple, rebuild the temple, rebuild the temple. And then there's a prayer, certainly in the Amidah, that reminds us to rebuild the temple so that they would never forget Now, certainly there were those that did or didn't think that it would ever happen, and then we see Israel become a state in 1948, and we know right now it looks pretty impossible for a temple to be rebuilt, but certainly it's been made. It's a promise of God, and that spot is basically the temple as the center of the universe. So again, under Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he took specific and deliberate steps to preserve the memory of the service, and was part of the transferring from the temple to the synagogue of many of the different rites. So prayers of thanksgiving, which were central to the prayer service, came from the temple. Certainly the study of the Torah, that continued on even from Babylon, but that became central also to the worship in the synagogue. Various forms and expressions of song and in dance that were part of worship became part of that became central to the synagogue as well. And this was all an expression of what had taken place over a long period of time. Now, going back to, let me reread that Psalm 65, 2, 3, and 5, because there's a second part to it. So it says, "To you, God in Zion, silence is praise. You who listen to prayer, to all you living creatures to come, how blessed are those you choose and bring near, so that they can remain in your courtyards. We will be satisfied with the goodness of your house, the holy place of your temple." So again, now when you have a different context for the temple, you don't just read it as, oh, well, there's this old temple, it was built by David, then there was another one built by Herod. It doesn't have any relativity to me, it doesn't even make sense to me, I don't know anything about it. Now I hope you can see that the services that were in the temple are now in the synagogue, and they're now in the Siddur. And so now when you read that from Psalms, that they can remain in your courtyards, you should know where the courtyards were and what took place in those courtyards, what kinds of services took place in those courtyards, and that you'll be satisfied with the goodness of your house, the holy place of your temple. It's very important. So you want to listen to that prayer and to draw near. Now, one of the key ingredients in all of this, and I've mentioned it, I think, in past programs here, is something we call the kavanah, or the attitude of the heart. That is absolutely essential. You can do anything, and you can perform any ritual, but without the right heart, nothing is going to be accomplished. And so this is certainly true with all the services in the temple, and all the services in the synagogue, and all the services in the home. It is how you approach. It is the attitude of your heart. What did it mean, then, to serve God with your whole heart? They were initially totally against elevating form above substance. And this is the battle that we have every day as we try to pray. Sometimes, we find ourselves distracted, or we think, oh, I'm just reading the same prayer over again. It doesn't mean a thing to me. We have to fight against rote memory of things. This is the hardest part, is serving God with one's whole heart in this way. But we can never let the ritual and the form be greater than the substance of the prayer and what comes from our heart. So we want to, certainly it requires total concentration, and sometimes concentration is really difficult. And I know in my own life there's mornings when I'm praying and my mind's wandering all over the place, but I believe it's the act of obedience, of coming before the Father, of setting aside the time and just doing it, and being disciplined in doing it. I would say that would be the greatest reward and benefit for you, is just the sheer discipline of it. I think sometimes in America we don't tend to be very disciplined people. We tend to function by emotion and feeling rather than actually the just doing of it, even though we didn't feel like doing it. And you can well imagine, even in temple times, that they would go up to perform a service and their heart wasn't in it. But they knew they needed to be there. That was the time that they would meet with God. That was the time the ceremony was performed. And sometimes the just doing of it can transform our heart as well. Let's read this next quote from Ta'an 2a. It says, "Just as the worship at the temple altar is called avodah, so is prayer called avodah, that is the service of the heart. When you pray, know before whom you are standing." And again, we've read one of these before, and I just want to draw your attention to it because this is the key in the service of the heart. Now, let me just say, spontaneity was important. And we have this tendency to think this was all just, it was all pre-done, there was just no life in it, no spontaneity. The idea of the fixed prayers were not designed to imprison the worshiper. And what is said, I find this very compelling, that one practices the prayers just as a musician practices. Now, you don't want a musician getting in front of you and playing who's not practiced, not rehearsed, and doesn't sound good. And so I'm thinking God may feel the same way, that He wants us to come into His presence practicing, preparing, sounding good, and not just winging it. Prayer, it's not supposed to be dependent on your mood or the setting that you're in. Now, for those of you who've traveled over to Israel, you know full well those guys get up real early in the morning on that airplane, and they don their tzitzit and their tefillin, and they are rocking the plane, and they're praying. They don't care where they are. It's the hour of prayer, and they're going to pray, and they're committed, and they're disciplined. And we have to really struggle with this idea of being in the right mood. And I can't tell you how many mornings that I would wake up and I'm not in the mood, but you just have to do it. You have to discipline yourself to do it, just like a musician does the same. So the main thing is we want to prevent regulated prayer, structured prayer, from descending into that which is just ritual. And that is really the basic fear that most people have. On the other side of it, there is a danger in when the prayer becomes way too spontaneous, if you know what I'm saying, and that there needs to be boundaries. And so I think if you understand that the Siddur, the prayer service, you understand where it came from, how it developed, and if you can function within that structure and just relax about it and allow there to be a certain amount of spontaneity, I think you'll get a whole lot more out of it. It's supposed to be the expression of your heart to God. And some of the fixed prayers really I find to be quite beautiful. So let's just read this next quote here. It says, "The pious of old used to wait an hour before praying in order to concentrate their thoughts upon their Father in heaven." I'd say that was pretty powerful, and I think many of us, that's sort of that we can't even imagine that. Preparing an hour to pray an hour kind of thing. But that's what they did because they understood, and you know full well, sometimes when you wake up or whatever time it is, you have to fight the distractions and the mind wandering, etc. And so in order to concentrate and their thoughts upon their Heavenly Father, they would take an hour to just prepare to pray, if you know what I mean. But it was the bridge for preparation. One of the things that we have to battle with is this little thing called time. And many of us are quite busy. We have jobs, we have places to be, we don't have a lot of time. Personally, I'm not a real early morning person. I'm not one of those that gets up at 4 or 5 in the morning and on my face before God interceding. That's just not how I'm wired. So some of us have a harder time than others, but we really, the most important thing is to set aside the time. Now, if you know you're one that's easily distracted, then you have to figure out a way to combat those distractions so that you can enter in. Again, one of the most important elements in all this, to me, is the concept of community worship. It's actually a weapon against the enemy. And if you can see yourself when you're praying as it being, as you're joining a community, that it's not just you there in your room by yourself and you're it and it's just you and God, but that you have actually literally joined with an entire community all around the globe to come into the presence of God. You know, whether it's 9 o'clock in New York or California, it matters not. We're trying to enter in together and be in a community. It says that basically, this prayer sustains the weak and supports the wavering. So there's something unique about the time and coming together, even though we're in different homes and different places in different countries. And I think I would encourage you to kind of consider that when you're praying, that you're lifting up the arms of your brothers and sisters around the world at the same time at prayer. It's not just you. It's not just about you. It's about the community, and we want to build the community. So we want to build up the weak, and we want to support those that are wavering. It is said that this kind of prayer is an effective weapon in the eternal battle to survive. Certainly the Jewish people understand that better than anybody. The prayers are communal prayers. Even though you're alone, you're saying them, you're talking about we and us in the plural. They're the prayers for the whole community of Israel, and then the individual needs of the community are kind of intertwined with those prayers. Again, the prayers are in the plural for a reason, because it's a community. It's said that the Jew finds his salvation through the community of Israel. And I believe the greatest revelations are yet to come when we all meet at the time of the appointed time of prayer. It's when the community is meeting with God. Now, over time, and we see this at the time of Daniel, there were actually 3 times that were considered to be the time of prayer. You remember he was in exile in Babylon, threw open the windows. I think we have a scripture coming up to that effect, but that he prayed 3 times a day. But he was in exile. He was praying the prayers that had been established at that point, which was not well established, but that he would pray in the morning, the afternoon, and the evening. The evening prayer did develop while they were in exile. So let's look at Daniel 6:11. And it says, "On learning the decree had been signed, Daniel went home. The windows of his upstairs rooms were open in the direction of Jerusalem, and there he kneeled down 3 times a day, and giving thanks before his God, just as he had been doing before." Well, what had he been doing before? He was one that was taken out of Israel, one of the best and the brightest, by King Nebuchadnezzar, and taken captivity into Babylon. Well, this was already well established in the temple, so he's just following the appointed time that was established by the temple service, the time of the offering, and he was turning to Jerusalem, just as if he were at the temple precincts himself, just as if he were making an offering, the burnt offering, the Korban Olah at that time. And I would just like to say these are very powerful times, and we'll talk about that. So for instance, I would say the revelation, if you will, of the Acharit Hayamim, the end of days, is given to Daniel. I'm sure you all recall. When is it given to him? It's given to him at the time of prayer, which is the time of the burnt offering. This is one of the appointed times. I'll probably talk more about this maybe in our next program, but we know there were weekly appointed times, which we call the Shabbat, and certainly everybody in this audience is probably familiar with the monthly or the annual appointed times, which is all the different festivals. But people don't think about the daily appointed times. I mean, is it like God just, okay, you're only going to meet once a week, now we have an appointed time, or we're only going to meet, once a year at Passover? The whole faith is structured for you to meet God. There's not a whole lot of time goes in between when you're meeting with God. So we have these appointed times that are developed with the offering. And so the revelation of the end of days, the entire revelation of the end of days, comes to Daniel at the time of the offering service, at the appointed times, and he is given the whole view. And we are fortunate that we have, and that he took the time, and that God gave it to him so that we ourselves can see what the future looks like. The Siddur itself transformed the offering service into the worship service of the synagogue. So that's kind of powerful. And again, the Hebrew prayer book that we have now is something that has grown slowly over time. Seems like a muddled mess most of the time, but it has certainly, prayers have been added, but I think if you take some time and really look at it, I would say probably 95% of the Siddur were our words from the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And I don't want to continually beat a dead horse, but I can't tell you how important this is. Going back a little bit to the Babylonian captivity, It's significant because that's where we find Daniel. And he is part of probably his prayer life and he's a big guy, he's a big cheese in Babylon. And so how his prayer life develops, I'm guessing, is sort of influencing the rest of the exiles in Babylon. So they were developing a way to worship God, again, without the temple. And in this context, we see a new emphasis on the study of Torah in a different way that had been when the first temple was standing. And really, in the end, it's all about worshiping God and having righteous behavior. And Daniel is really kind of a roadmap for that, I think. So I would encourage you as well to take some time and reread Daniel and consider when he received his revelation, how he received his revelation, and the influence that Daniel would have had on the exiles in Babylon of the time. Now here's a quote from Solomon Schlechter, he's quite prolific, written quite a bit on the kingdom of heaven and various other topics. He says, "The Bible is the record of God's revelation to Israel. The Hebrew prayer book is the record of Israel's self-revelation to God." Let me read that one more time. The Bible is the record of God's revelation to Israel. The Hebrew prayer book is the record of Israel's self-revelation to God. So that is, I find that kind of interesting, and that really pretty well sums it up for me. Now I want to get back to this idea of the daily appointed times. Again, God, from the very beginning, into Genesis, on the fourth day, we see this concept of the moed, the appointed time, the moedim. So we naturally connect that to the festivals. But I'm submitting to you that there is a daily appointed time, a daily moed, if you will. And God designed it that way so we couldn't get very far from Him, that every day we would meet with Him. Now this particular prayer is called, based on the burnt offering, the Tamid Korban Olah. It's called the continual elevation offering. That's just one of its translations. The elevation offering, the Olah, means that the smoke goes up. It's described as a regular offering. That's because it's every day. It's every morning, it's every afternoon, or what we would call evening. I do believe that the whole structure, and it was evening and it was morning, is based on, or that the offerings were based on this idea in creation of it was evening and it was morning, day 2, day 1. So we have these daily appointed times they were established by God, and they were established in the Torah, and that's the time that we are supposed to approach Him. From Exodus 29:38 through 42, this is what you should offer upon the altar: sheep within their first year, 2 every day continually. So now I want to draw your attention here to the word continually. So the 2 sheep that are offered, they're the Tamid Korban Olah, the elevation offering. They're offered every day, morning and evening, and they are referred to as being 2 every day continually. They're the continual elevation offering. I'd just like to plant that for you. This was done every single day, the entire year, even on Yom Kippur. There was never a day in which the elevation offering, the Tamid Korban Olah, was not brought. And the reason it was mentioned in this context here in Exodus is because it was offered actually before the tabernacle itself was even dedicated. And to me, if we're talking about Adam and Hava, Adam and Eve, when they covered themselves with the skins, I would have to say that we are going back even farther and talking about the continual elevation offering, because that particular offering was completely consumed. Nothing was left. The only thing that didn't burn up was the skins, and the skins were given to the priest. So if Adam is functioning as a priest in the garden, in his service, his avodah, and the garden is a temple, and the priest received the skin of the burnt offering, then Adam received the skin, and that was a burnt offering. So I'm guessing even in the time of the garden, we had some application here for the daily elevation offering, the Tamid Korban Olah, that I believe it has very ancient roots. So we'll probably talk more about this in our next session. Let me just read one more quote from, this is also from Numbers 28, 1 through 8, but it says, "The one lamb shall you offer in the morning, and the lamb that is second you shall offer between the evenings." You might recognize that expression from the Passover in Exodus 12. In between the evenings has been noted to be 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and so that was when the Passover was offered up. And so this offering was offered at the time of the Passover, and so there's a lot going on in that afternoon offering, but they were offered continually, morning and evening. I'm just going to plant this in your brain, because when we come to the New Testament, we are going to see all kinds of examples where normally we just blow by them and we don't even think about what it might be talking about, and you're going to find that what's being referred to, the fruit of our lips, the elevation offering, the burnt offering at the time of the morning and the evening. So we'll be talking about that in more detail next time, talking about the 2 lambs and the significance of it, and we'll reread that passage in Numbers. So see you then. Shalom.